in any tough negotiations of any kind, or in arguments over things in committees. I imagine you have been, and at a certain point you realize that somebody on the other side doesn't want you to say something that you know is true. And saying that is actually going to make everybody feel very uncomfortable, including yourself. Because it's something that is going to break any concord or harmony or sense of ease that is in the group. It is going to be a form of confrontation. And I think that Lincoln and Churchill and Johnson all sense that aggressive evil will count on the hesitancy of any good individual to make that kind of confrontation, because it means itself being aggressive. But as Johnson once said, yes, I was proud too, but mine was defensive pride. Meaning, when someone is bearing down on you, then you react with aggression. And you can see in that a miniature version of the way in which Churchill tried to frame the whole story of appeasement prior to the Second World War. There was too long a period of time in which the truth was not told about what was really going on and what the designs of Germany really were and how England should really prepare. I think we also see this in the House Divided speech, where basically Lincoln tries to suggest what has really been going on in the 1850s in terms of what you might call nothing less than a political conspiracy. And it is time to tell the real story of this conspiracy, though he doesn't use the word, he uses the word machinery. It's time to tell the real story of this machinery, and although you cannot demonstrate it beyond a shadow of a doubt in a scientific way, you can make a good inference from human motivation of what these various political groups and people are up to, whether it comes from Douglas or Taney or others. And I think Lincoln in the House Divided speech makes that conclusion. I'd say also that this writing of all three involves a hope and a faith in the moral progress of humankind. I won't dwell on that except to say it's not Rousseauistic, but it does involve a sense that things for humanity can get better, that they will get better. I mean, even Samuel Johnson, who's a little hesitant on this, talks about the barbarity of the age of Queen Elizabeth. Talks about that in the preface to Shakespeare. So here you have someone just about 150 years after Elizabeth dies talking about the dark aspects of Queen Elizabeth's reign, using the word barbarity. So there is a sense of a faith in some increasing benevolence, that increasingly force will not be the way in which right is propagated or claimed, that it will be something better than that. I think maybe a little in Lincoln's lecture on discoveries and inventions, you see this notion of the amelioration, or the possibility of the amelioration of the human condition through increased knowledge. And that there, in a way, technology is part of it. I think also there's a sense that when sacrifices are made, that there will be, or that there can be, something that comes about from it that will improve matters or resolve them. And even a line such as the one in the Gettysburg Address, where he says, "We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain," means that there's a promise of the living to the dead, that the struggle for the improvement of the resolution that they hoped for is going to be a struggle that isn't going to be given up, and that it will be carried through to some kind of victory. Well, I'm just really going over what John went over, though in another kind of way, just adding a couple of nuances, and I agree too completely about what I would call a set of primary principles that each one of these writers holds to, but they're very hard to pin down. Because in a sense, they're not, I think, what we would usually call ideologically oriented. It's not some checklist of things that you have to believe in. it is a more fluid sense of adjusting one's practical wisdom, what the Greeks called phronesis, one sense of judging the situation as you go along according to certain principles. And in that regard, Churchill would say that he would constantly adjust his own views to the current situation. And we say, well, of course, that's what every politician does. Actually, no. Some politicians don't do that. They simply try to impress their views and force the current situation into a certain mold rather than recognizing that it takes some flexibility and imagination. But in one of the things that I think these sets of principles allow these writers to do is, in the way that Johnson describes it, is you take the trunk of the tree and shake it in order to get all the fruit to fall down. Not climb up to every twig and pick off each fruit. That you shake that central trunk. And John Masefield, who is poet laureate in England, wrote some lines about Churchill, and I won't quote all of them, just a few. The poetry is not great, but I'm not reading it for the poetry. Most of the things poet laureates write aren't great, but at least in the last 70 or 80 years. But he described Churchill this way. He says, the divine fortune, watching life's affairs, justly endowed him with what fortune may, with sense of storm, and where the center lay, with tact of deed, in some wise, witty way. I think all three of these writers seek where the center is. They want to know what the pivot or the fulcrum of an issue is. It's like that great telescope, the Mount Palomar telescope in California. It's got a mirror that's 200 inches wide. It's huge. It weighs many tons. And it's moved by a little electric motor that generates 1/4 horsepower, because they've got it just on the balance point of the telescope. So it mules it all around the sky and up and down like this. And it's probably no more powerful than a motor you get in a blender. But this motor is able to do it. And I think that these writers constantly look for that fulcrum point. And it helps them enormously in their debates. And of course, it's what I think good lawyers look for in an argument. They look for that point that is absolutely necessary and sufficient for producing a result if you win that point in an argument. Yet at the same time, I think they can adjust these principles, as I've mentioned, that the Lincoln of 1848 is not the Lincoln of 1858, at least I think so. I think he changes. Samuel Johnson in the early 1750s is not Samuel Johnson writing the lives of the poets at all. There's a Rambler essay where Johnson says, there's a lot of evil in the world, but we basically have to trust to the superintendence of some larger good, and every evil we see is somehow designed to work into a larger calculus of the morality of the universe and so forth. Well, when he writes the life of Pope, he makes fun of Pope for producing this sentiment in the essay on man, and seems to move away from it. Seems rather not to have an answer to the mystery of the existence of natural and moral evil. Seems not to subscribe to that kind of easy theodicy. And I think Churchill changes too. He changes politically and doesn't always win the support of his fellow party members, and capable of even changing party in respect. One of the questions that I can't resolve in my own mind, that's an interesting question, maybe the seminar won't have time or inclination to get into it, it's fine, but it's a question popped up to me, is part of the basis for some of these principles what is sometimes called, though it has various definitions, it's very hard to pin down, but what is sometimes called natural law. That is to say that there are very fundamental things about human beings and their rights and dignity that apply everywhere. They're universal. Now, Occasionally that doctrine is viewed as being a very conservative one.